I never should have entered that antique store, and I definitely shouldn't have bought that mask. Gannon's is known for buying and selling rare and unique antiques, and I wanted to impress my friends with a unique Halloween costume this year, so I thought the perfect solution would be to get my hands on a genuine antique costume, one of those strange, ultra-creepy ones from the 1800s or earlier. Sure, it would cost me, but can you really put a price on standing out? The bell over the door jingled dully as I opened the door and walked in. The proprietor, and grey, bent-over man with a thick, bushy beard and thick, round-rimmed spectacles who was 90, if he was a day, casually acknowledged me and went back to the ancient book he was examining. The store wasn't big, but it had space. Only every last bit of that space was filled with relics of bygone eras. Not the usual furniture, silverware, and paintings of your typical antique shop. No, everything here had a story, and as such, everything here commanded a premium price. There was an old cavalry saber that was known to have killed no less than 7 men in the Civil War. It even still had flecks of blood from its victims spattered along the blade and hilt. There was an old rope noose that had supposedly been used to hang a witch during the Salem witch trials. There was an ancient tome with strange symbols on the cover that once belonged to a European court wizard. There was even a hat that once belonged to a certain H. Holmes. The stories attached to each item were historical, mystical, and often macabre, and I loved it. I didn't believe in magic or mysticism, angels and demons, or anything else beyond what science could explain. That didn't mean that I wasn't fascinated by stories involving them, though. How much more interesting would the world be if the supernatural actually did exist? It was a tantalizing proposition, and it's why I had to buy it as soon as I saw it. It was a wolf mask. Not a mask made to look like a wolf, but a mask made out of the skin and fur of a wolf's head and neck. It was a masterful work of preservation and artistry that looked as alive on display that day as the creature itself must have looked in life. I picked it up carefully, turning it over and around in my hand so I could see it from every angle. The work was beyond fine. I couldn't even see the seams and threads that held it together. Not a single hair seemed to be missing from the thick grey fur. The teeth were real and firmly fixed into the snout. I assumed they were so well done because the original jaws had been used to form the snarling mouth. The eyes were glass, and far too lifelike for such an aged item. Perfect replicas of thin glass set in the eye sockets. I had to have it. I checked the story card next to the original display. The price was outrageous, but I didn't care. Not only was the mask perfect, but the supposed history couldn't have been more ideal for the season. It read simply, "Enchanted mask made from the preserved skin of a loup-garou slain in Burgundy, France in 1137 AD. Do not wear at night." "Oh, ho, 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 ho," I grunted excitedly. "I have plans for you." I brought the mask and story card to the checkout. Old man Gannon checked the item, and me with more scrutiny than I was really comfortable with before speaking. "Heed the warning, boy," he said sternly. "It wouldn't do for you to tempt fate." I chuckled, ignoring the fact that he called me boy. He was probably the oldest man in town, so everyone was boy or girl to him. "You don't have to worry about me," I assured him. "You got any more documentation that goes with this? If I'm going to fork over $2,000 for a mask, I want as much provenance as I can get." Old man Gannon grunted derisively. "Of course I have documents that go with it. A fair few, actually. Be sure that you read them and take proper precautions." "Of course," I replied seriously, lying through my teeth. "The supernatural is not real after all. It's a myth, legend, just stories. What this mask was to me was the foundation of the absolute best Halloween costume I had ever concocted. Sure, a werewolf costume wouldn't be especially unique, but with that mask, it would be the most frighteningly real one our town had ever seen. The old man went into the back room and quickly returned with a binder filled with documents in protectors and a small leather-bound journal. "These are the provenance," he declared. "The journal is of particular interest as it belonged to a previous owner of the mask, a Mr. Archibald Wembley of London, wrote it in the years 1512 through 1514. He went mad after wearing the mask and killed 2 people before he was cut down in the street. Witnesses swore that he looked more animal than man before he died. The police report is document 123. I set the mask on the counter and quickly leafed through the documents. There were originals and English translations for each. "All this and you're only charging $2,000? I asked incredulously. "Such a unique relic with this much provenance together. It has to be worth more." Old man Gannon nodded his head. Yes, it is," he confirmed. "I actually paid more for it myself, but he trailed off. Something about that particular item unsettles me. I wish to be rid of it sooner rather than later, so I'm taking a loss for my own peace of mind. I didn't question it. If this old man was willing to let his superstitions be my gain, I was perfectly fine with it. I paid for the mask and happily took it home. Looking back, I should never have been so sure of myself, nor so proud, nor so certain about how the world works. The events that followed changed my perspective of the nature of reality itself, and I don't think I'll ever be able to go back to how I was. In my defense, and also to remove any possibility that I can claim ignorance if I get desperate enough, I need to confess that I did read the provenance documents right away. I didn't read them to get any warnings to heed, or as some kind of user manual. I read them to learn the history of my beautiful, terrifyingly creepy wolf mask. Having the story at the tip of my tongue top tell at will would truly be the icing on what I knew would be a most impressive and frightening cake, or, rather, costume. The earliest documents were all about the supposed loup-garou that was terrorizing the Burgundian countryside, and the hunt to put an end to the gruesome string of murders it was blamed for. Document 20 was a notice celebrating that the foul beast had finally been killed and skinned by a visiting huntsman who only asked to be allowed to keep the skin and take it back to him home as his reward. The local ruler, only too happy to get off so cheaply, permitted it. The huntsman wrote that he brought the hide to a supposed witch named Lucia, who lived alone on a mountain named Musla in modern-day Slovakia. He paid her handsomely with instructions to use the hide to create an item of power, one that would make him strong. Apparently, she obliged, making the wolf mask, and he was happy, but it came with a strict set of rules. 1. Never wear the mask at night. 2. Never wear the mask on the day or night of the full moon. 3. Never wear the mask during the autumnal equinox. 4. Always invoke the name of Christ before donning the mask. The man must have been wildly superstitious because he followed the rules religiously. The following documents are filled with fanciful tales of the huntsman performing mighty deeds that led to him earning a minor lordship before retiring to administer his land holdings and eventually dying of old age. What followed after was one document after another that spoke of the mask passing to a new owner who either did not read or chose not to follow the rules, and how each one ultimately went mad, committing a varying number of murders, and being either killed during the apprehension or executed for their crimes. It gained a reputation as a cursed item that turned men into mindless beasts and drove them to kill and even cannibalize their victims. "Holy crap!" I exclaimed as I finished reading the last page in the binder. "This is even better than I thought. I wonder what that Wembley guy wrote in his diary." It was getting late, so I decided to put off reading the diary for another day. I picked up my mask and looked it over, admiring it for both its craftsmanship and its history. "You just might be the coolest thing I'll ever own," I said to it as I caressed its cheek. I looked into the glass eyes, and maybe it was a trick of the light, or maybe it was the lateness of the hour playing tricks with my mind, but I could have sworn those eyes, those glass eyes, looked back at me. I awoke the next morning to my girlfriend letting herself into my apartment. Her key clicked in the lock, and the door squeaked noisily as she opened it. "Wake up, sleepyhead," she called. I sat up and groaned in response as I rubbed the sleep out of my eyes. I checked the clock on my nightstand, saw the time, and got annoyed. "It's 7 a.m. on a Saturday. We have plans, remember?" she called out. "We're supposed to—" "What is this?" she asked. Her tone changed from businesslike to pure excitement. I stepped out of my bedroom clad in nothing but my night pants. She was excitedly holding up the wolf mask and admiring it. "It's a cursed wolf mask," I replied with a yawn. "It's the centerpiece of my Halloween costume this year." "It looks so real," she said admiringly. Then her expression darkened and she put the mask down on the table. "Did you say cursed?" she sharply inquired. "Yeah," I yawned again. "It's almost 1,000 years old. The documents it came with say that a bunch of its previous owners went psycho and started killing people." "And you bought it?" she practically shrieked. "And you're going to wear it?" I filled the coffee maker and turned it on. "Don't tell me you believe in magic, voodoo, curses and all that nonsense," I replied tiredly. She took pause at that. I knew her answer. It was a major point of agreement between us. What science can't explain either isn't real, or just hasn't been properly explained yet. Nothing is supernatural. She finally replied, "It's just—" She paused. "If a bunch of people who owned it really did turn into psycho killers, there's got to be something there." I poured a cup of black coffee from the still brewing pot and took a sip. It was too hot, but I didn't care. Sure there is, I replied. Social contagion. People believe it's cursed, so they respond as though it's cursed. It's nothing special. It must have made sense to her, because her whole attitude changed again. Have you tried it on yet? She asked with a slight smile, her fear replaced with the admiration and curiosity she had when she first laid eyes on the mask. It struck me that I hadn't, so I picked it up, looked my girlfriend in the eyes, said Jesus Christ in a mocking tone, and put it on. It felt perfect, as though it were made just for me. It slipped over my head easily and seemed to snug down to a perfect form fit. It had no odor, and I could see clearly with a full field of view through the glass eyes. Not until just now, I replied teasingly. Eek! She shrieked. What? I asked, alarmed, turning my head rapidly to see what had so alarmed her. The mouth moved when you talked, she squealed. It moved, and it moved in a perfect match for your words. I cocked my head to the side and looked at her quizzically. For real? I asked. It's moving with my mouth. Yes, she said excitedly. Go see in the mirror. I did. I spoke. Abracadabra, hocus pocus, jiggity jocus, I said to my reflection. Sure enough, the mouth moved in a lupine imitation of my own mouth movements. The movement was so well synced that I could swear I even saw the lips move, although I knew it to be impossible. I took the mask off and admired it with the fattest grin of all time on my face. That's amazing, I exclaimed. That old witch was a real master. I didn't know people even knew how to make a mask's mouth move in the 12th century. I know, right? My girlfriend Tiffany said with as much excitement as I felt. You're going to have an amazing Halloween costume this year. I removed the mask, smiled at her, and nodded my head in affirmation. Just one thing, she said with a hint of confusion. What's with that thing you said before you put the mask on? It took me a moment to remember what she was talking about. Oh, I snapped my fingers as I remembered. There was a silly little list of rules. I was mocking them. I grabbed the folder of provenance and flipped to the page with the rules on it. See, I said, pointing at the small passage. 4 ridiculous rules. Tiffany read them quickly and looked at me with a touch of confusion. People actually believed this crap, she said incredulously. I know, right? I laughed. She laughed with me for a bit, then stopped suddenly and glared at me. Wait a minute, she said sternly. How much did you pay for this mask anyway? Cha! The next few days were perfectly ordinary until the 17th. That was the day I finished assembling my costume, and one of 2 full moons in a row this year. I remember bringing home a pair of retro ripped jeans to go with the red plaid flannel shirt, theatre prop quality werewolf gloves, complete with a set of long claws tipping the fingers, and other clothing reminiscent of an 80s era movie werewolf. The sun had set hours earlier. I obtained the pants shopping with Tiffany after our dinner date, and I was absolutely thrilled. I couldn't wait to try it all on and see how it went together. It was glorious. I donned the outfit, then slowly, almost ritualistically lowered the mask over my head to complete the costume. It was like magic in the mirror. I looked myself over and I loved what I saw. I looked like something out of Teen Wolf, only better. Sure, I could have achieved something very much like it far more cheaply. I could have just gone to Spirit Halloween, bought a costume or a rubber mask, and went to Walmart for finishing touches and adjustments, and done a satisfactory job for under $200. But that's not what I wanted. I wanted the Riz. I wanted to stand out among all the other costumed partygoers at the fraternity Halloween party. This costume absolutely did it, and I couldn't have been happier. In my ecstasy, I noticed a feeling running through my body as though there was a kind of energy coursing through me. It wasn't as simple as a burning in my blood or my nerves were on fire. No, it was a feeling of power, as though I was still myself, but also something more. I felt as though I could toss 4 men over my shoulders and run a marathon. I felt as though I could get in a bar fight and kick every ass in the place. I felt godly. I removed the mask after a few minutes and inspected my outfit without it. I felt normal again, and somehow it felt wrong. I felt like my ordinary self was somehow no longer enough. I felt incomplete, like I removed a piece of myself when I removed the mask. Stop being ridiculous, I told my reflection. You're letting myth and superstition influence you. You're better than that. And yet, I felt like I was lying to myself. Right there, staring at my reflection, I felt like the man looking back at me wasn't really me, like something unknowable was missing. I looked at my reflection, and it felt as though I was looking at someone else, someone I didn't really know, and who could never truly know me in return. I shook my head to clear the strange thoughts and center myself again. Pictures, I reminded myself. Tiffany wanted pictures so she could put together something complimentary. I took out my phone and held it up to the mirror to take a picture and paused. I couldn't send her a picture like this. My costume was incomplete. I needed to wear the mask or else my costume wasn't really my costume. And how could she possibly match her costume to mine if I sent her an incomplete photo? I picked up the mask to put it on and paused. I paused to look at it, to admire it. I looked into its lifelike glass eyes. I stroked its fur as though it were a living thing. "You're mine," I told it in a low, almost silent voice. "You're mine, and I am your master." I continued to stare into those perfectly crafted glass eyes, losing myself in them, and wanting nothing in the world so much as I wanted to put that mask on and forget myself. Slowly, almost robotically, I raised it up and gently lowered it over my head. I felt a rush of euphoria, like what I felt earlier, only 100 times more potent. I took my phone in hand, opened the camera app, raised it, and snapped a single picture of myself in the mirror. I opened text messaging, selected Tiffany, attached the message, and typed the following text. "It's complete, and now I'm complete." I hit send. I looked into the mirror and met my own gaze staring back at me through those glass eyes that had no business looking as real and alive as they did, and then the world went blank. I awoke the next day with no idea where I was. I opened my eyes only to be greeted by the rising sun in the middle of a forest. A forest? There was a forest outside of town, but it wasn't exactly a short walk if you catch my drift. It was easily a half an hour's drive once you got out of town, and not exactly the kind of thing you just get up and walk to like you're taking the dog out to the local community park. I woke up there, and not on the edge either, but well inside the borders, and I was covered in a red sticky substance that could only be blood, and my stomach hurt like I had gotten drunk and did my best to eat my own body weight at the local Asian buffet. What the? I trailed off as I looked at my hands and arms and was taken aback by the dried red and brown goop covering them. I looked down at myself and saw that I was still in my costume, and my clothing was utterly ruined, covered in a deep red liquid that was surely blood. I realized that I was still wearing the mask, and I ripped it off of my head in a panic. My breath came in great heaves, uncontrollable, and my head began to swim as I hyperventilated. I closed my eyes and forced myself to calm down. I made myself breathe slower, and slower, and slower still, until I finally brought it down to normal. I focused on my heart rate and gradually brought it down with a blend of deep breathing and mind clearing. Once I had myself physically under control, I looked at myself again. How did I get covered in such a disgustingly massive amount of blood? Why did my stomach hurt so much? How did the wolf mask manage to stay clean when the rest of me was drenched in filth? And why did I? My stomach finally gave up and rebelled. I dropped the wolf mask and fell to my knees, retching and vomiting a copious amount of stomach contents. I vomited even as I found myself losing my breath and desperately wanting to breathe. I vomited even as my lack of breath began to make my head swim. I vomited even as my vision blurred and blackened at the edges. Then I was able to breathe again. I took in great gasping gulps of air. I heaved and panted as I sought to restore my oxygen supply. Then I vomited again. If possible, I can say that the second round was worse than the third. It didn't hit me so continuously as to cut me off from breathing completely like the first round did, but it did let me get just enough breath to barely subsist before striking again until I thought I would surely pass out, and then it subsided just long enough to tease me again before taking over and nearly choking me to death over and over and over again until I wished that I could just die and get it over with. When I was finally finished, my stomach felt better, but there was a glistening pile of partially digested stomach contents all over the ground in front of me. I wish I could say that I knew what I was looking at, but it was all so thoroughly masticated that I couldn't hope pick one bit from another. All I knew was that none of it looked cooked, and I didn't see anything that could pass for a vegetable anywhere in the nasty mix. My stomach felt better, though. I picked up my mask, chose a random direction, and began to walk. I must have chosen well, because after only 2 hours, I came across a road. I'm not ignorant. I've driven in and out of town plenty of times. I know my way around in town and around the outskirts of my hometown. That's why I knew that I needed to go left once I reached this road if I wanted to get home. How long would it take? Fucked if I know. All that mattered was I was going the right direction, and the rest would fall into place one way or another. And fall into place it did. Less than an hour of walking later, a random pickup truck pulled over. The driver listened to my story and told me to hop in the bed of his truck and he'd take me into town. I did it gratefully, and he was as good as his word. Better even. He dropped me off outside my apartment building, told me to stay off the drugs, and went on his merry way. I went inside, took the elevator to my floor, opened my door without needing to use my key, which was also weird since I never, ever left my apartment without locking it, and immediately rushed to the shower so I could get clean and feel human again. I was brushing my teeth for the third time when I heard my phone ringing. It was on the floor, pushed up against the wall under the sink. Why? I don't know, but I found it, pulled it out, and answered the call. "Where have you been?" Tiffany practically shrieked in my ear. "I've been calling and texting all night and I haven't heard a word from you. If you didn't pick up the phone this time, I was going to call the cops to make sure you weren't dead." On the one hand, it felt surreal being yelled at so mundanely after the freaky mystery I woke up to. On the other, what in the ever-living hell was going on? I let my girlfriend yell for a while until she was all shouted out. Then I responded. "I don't know where I was last night," I told her in a shaky voice. One minute I was home, the next I was waking up in the middle of nowhere covered in blood. This set off another wave of panicked screeching that eventually settled down into sobbing and expressions of gratitude that I was all right. She told me she was coming right over and hung up before I could protest. I had a very, very bad feeling about her coming over. It literally took all day to get Tiffany settled down and comfortable with the fact that, in spite of everything, I was all right. I didn't tell her about how my body had violently purged my stomach of an inhuman amount of raw flesh shortly after waking up. I was already washed up, and my bloody costume was in the wash, getting as clean as I could hope for it to be. It was actually the laundry that got her settled down. She volunteered to take my costume out of the dryer, and was absolutely delighted to see that I had added to it by dyeing in a bunch of red and brown staining. "It actually looks like you ripped something apart and ate it," she said excitedly. "You're so good at making Halloween costumes." "Yeah," I said slowly before trailing off. "I modified it." She didn't give me a chance to finish my words or my thoughts before she jumped me. Perhaps if she hadn't been so excited and relieved that I was safe and healthy, things would have turned out differently. Perhaps if our intimate life wasn't so frequent and vigorous, everything would have turned out differently. As it was, I succumbed to her passion, and we fell asleep in each other's arms for an afternoon nap. I awoke before Tiffany did, and I went to the living room to examine the mask. I felt scared holding it. It felt wrong to put my hands upon that artifact, as though I was touching a power I could not hope to control or comprehend. I turned it over and over and over again, examining it to the finest detail. Why did this mask, out of everything I wore last night, not have a single drop of blood on it? Why was the last thing I could remember putting it on and taking a selfie? That thought triggered something in me, and I took out my phone. I didn't have it with me in the forest, and I couldn't remember checking the picture I took or sending it to Tiffany. I opened the photos and looked at the last picture I took. I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe a photo of myself mid-metamorphosis. Maine. I thought I'd catch myself becoming something other than, well, me. What I actually saw was me in my costume with my phone in my hand. I looked at the picture again, not really believing that it could be so mundane, and I thought I could see something different in those lifelike glass eyes. I thought that maybe, just maybe, there was a hint of something in there that was not only me. But no, it couldn't be. The supernatural isn't real after all. It's all hokum, bunk, small-minded garbage that enlightened people like me didn't believe in. The sun had set. It wasn't down for long, but it was the second day of the rarest kind of blue moon event, the kind where the full moon happens 2 days in a row. I looked into the eyes of the mask. This perfect, masterfully crafted mask, lifted it up and lowered it onto my head. I woke up the next morning, the 19th of October, a mere week ago, to the most horrifying sight of my life. I awoke on the floor of my own apartment, but once again I was covered in blood and filth. "How?" I screamed in horror, not understanding where the ungodly mess had come from. My stomach was killing me. I rushed to my bathroom and barely made it to the toilet before my stomach decided to evacuate its contents. Then, and keep evacuating itself, even when there was nothing but water and bile left to push out. It went on and on and on, until I wished I would just die, rather than endure another moment of such violent illness. I flushed the toilet whenever I had the presence of mind to do so, without checking to see what had come out of me. I had seen what came out the day before, and I didn't want to see it again. Perhaps that's why I failed to recognize any of the bits and parts, the solid matter mixed in with the wretched fluids that erupted from my stomach and out of my mouth. Regardless, I was glued to the toilet until my stomach finally settled down after who knows how long. Then I stripped my bloody clothing and took a shower so hot I felt like it might burn the skin from my bones, and I was okay with that. I felt dirty inside and out. It was wrong in every way, down to my soul if I had believed it at the time. I felt wrong, dirty, and thoroughly corrupted. I was in the shower for an hour, lost in feelings rather than thought, wondering what had happened and how I managed to wind up covered in blood again in my own apartment. It was only when I finally shut off the water and was halfway through drying off that it hit me. "Tiffany!" I screamed and I ran to my bedroom. I burst into my bedroom and was greeted by the most horrific mess I could possibly imagine. The entire room was splattered with blood and viscera. Not a surface was spared, as at least some red drops or other. Scraps was on every surface, every knick-knack, everything in the room. My screams only got louder and more insistent as I scanned the room and found the head of Tiffany, my beautiful Tiffany, beloved girlfriend of 3 years, on a pillow, fully detached from her body, lifeless eyes staring off into the void. I hurled myself to it, reaching desperately, not willing to believe in what I was seeing. I picked it up and stared into her sightless eyes and burst into tears. "Tiffany," I sobbed. "How? Why?" I looked around and took the horrific scene in. I recognized the various parts of my beloved scattered around the room, legs and arms tossed about, bones scattered all over, looking like they had been gnawed upon by a great beast, and not one of her internal organs to be seen. I remembered how upset my stomach was when I woke up, and how distended it appeared before I threw up the contents in a prolonged and violent fit. How much of her had I simply flushed away, not knowing what I was doing because I refused to just open my eyes as I vomited up my sick. I dropped Tiffany's head back onto my bed and scrambled to the living room. I picked up the diary of Archibald Wembley and read it thoroughly. Much of it was a repeat of what I had already read before in the other provenance, until I got to the end. Here is what is read. I should have listened to the rules. I should have learned from the mistakes of others. I didn't, and now I am paying the price for my foolishness. The mask is gone, but I can feel its influence on me even as I write these words. I blacked out again last night, and when I awoke this morning, my family was dead, ripped apart from some foul beast, every last one of them. My wife Abigail and the children George, Franklin, Erin, and Caleb, all of them were torn apart. Only I was spared, and I was covered in such an amount of blood and gore that it could only have come from many animals, of a family of people. I ignored the rules. I wore the mask at night. I wore it on the full moon. It amused me to do so, and I did it without once invoking the name of Christ for protection. I was a fool, and my family has paid the price for my pride and lack of faith. The mask is gone, but I can still feel it within me somehow, as though it has become a part of me. I do not know what the future will bring, but I fear it will be more bloodshed, and it will be me in some beastly form rending apart my fellow man in bestial glee. I only hope that someone stops me before I go too far. God help me and spare the innocent. I put the diary down and sat back stunned. Then it dawned on me. Where was the wolf mask? I tore my apartment searching for it, I really did, but I could not find it. Still, I can feel its presence, like it's lost, but also not. It's like it's here with me, even though I cannot see it. Today is only 5 days until Halloween. The sun has set and I feel strong, stronger than I have any right to feel. My dead girlfriend remains rotting in my bedroom, and it smells horrible. The neighbors are sure to complain soon. I don't understand what's going on, but I do know this. I never should have bought that mask. And once I bought it, I never should have broken the rules. How was I supposed to know it was a real cursed object? There's no science that can explain curses. Real, magical curses. Magic isn't real, right? Who am I kidding? I believe in magic. Now. But I came to believe too late. Too late to save my beloved Tiffany, and too late to save myself. I need to flee. I need to get away from here as soon as possible. I can feel the beast inside of me, and it wants to get out. I need to get as far away from people as possible, to disappear and never be seen again. But I'm hungry, and there's a great nightclub not far from here, and the night is young. Perhaps I'll stop in for a bite to eat before I begin my journey. Working night shifts on the Golden Gate Bridge isn't a glamorous job. Most of the time, it's just endless stretches of quiet with the occasional sound of cars whooshing by. From my small station on the bridge, the world felt hollowed out, like it had closed in around the faint hum of machinery, the gentle rock of the bay far below, and the endless coils of fog that wrapped themselves around the bridge. I took the position mainly for the solitude. I liked the quiet hours, the chance to breathe and think without interruption. But there was something else that tugged me here, a draw that I couldn't quite name. Something about the span of this bridge with its looming towers and swaying cables, the way it seemed to slice the sky in two. There's a mythic quality to the place, a silent authority that makes you feel small and out of time, especially when it's just you and the water below. On foggy nights, the bridge transformed. Thick banks of mist rolled in from the Pacific, cloaking the bridge in swathes of grey so dense that even the red towers blurred into ghostly shapes. Tonight was one of those nights. The mist hugged everything tight, muffling sound and swallowing the glow of streetlights until the bridge was little more than a collection of dim orange halos floating in the haze. It was a quiet that invited memories, and though I usually enjoyed it, tonight it felt off somehow. I walked along my usual route, scanning for anything unusual, any sign of people or potential danger, but tonight felt different, as if the fog held secrets of its own, and I was an intruder. Halfway through my shift, while pacing along the northern side, I saw a figure near one of the support beams. It's not unusual for people to find their way here, either tourists who've stayed too late or folks just seeking solitude of their own. But this figure seemed strange, unmoving. Their back was to me, and they were staring over the rail, body leaning ever so slightly forward. I called out, raising my voice to cut through the mist. "Hey! It's not safe to be that close to the edge!" My words floated out, hollow and faded by the fog. No response. They didn't even shift, just stayed there, transfixed by something beyond the rail. I walked closer, my footsteps absorbed by the thick air, and a sense of something almost ancient wrapped around me, like I'd stepped into someone else's memory. Finally, I was close enough to make out more of the figure, and a jolt of unease swept over me. They wore a dark coat, the fabric looking tattered at the edges, hanging in loose, irregular strips that fluttered faintly in the breeze. Something about their stance was wrong too, unnaturally rigid, as if they were carved from stone. The figure's face was just out of sight, obscured by the angle and the hood pulled low over their head. But as I approached, the silence between us deepened, and I noticed that even the wind seemed to have quieted. "Are you okay?" I tried again, louder, yet with an edge of hesitation I hadn't expected in my own voice. The figure didn't turn. They stayed fixated on the water, posture unchanging, hands resting on the rail in a way that seemed to anchor them, to keep them there even as the mist swirled like a restless tide around them. I took another step forward, wondering if maybe they were in some kind of trance or suffering from shock. But before I could say another word, they moved. It wasn't a natural motion. It was sharp, too quick, as if a string had pulled them upright. In one smooth turn, they finally faced me, and I felt a strange cold twist inside. Their face was shrouded, not by darkness or the shadow of their hood, but by something that seemed impossible, a perfect, empty void. No features, no eyes, nose, mouth, just a blank, hollow surface where a face should have been, like a mask made of sheer emptiness. Yet somehow, I felt their gaze upon me, and it was sharper than any stare I'd ever felt. I was rooted to the spot, words dead on my tongue. The air around us felt like it was pressing down, thick with something I couldn't name. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if assessing me, an odd curiosity in that faceless gaze. I felt exposed, like I was being laid bare under a microscope. The moment stretched, silent, my heart beat loud in my ears. Every instinct told me to turn and walk away. But I couldn't move. I was locked in place by that faceless stare, by the unnatural presence that seemed to seep from it, filling the space between us. And then, as abruptly as it had turned, the figure shifted back to the railing. It leaned over the edge, hands resting on the metal, and somehow the pose looked sad. Like someone deep in thought, lost to a memory or a longing that only they could understand. I took a step back, forcing myself to breathe, to regain control of my body and thoughts. This was just someone playing a trick, I told myself. Some sick prank to spook the night guard, but I didn't believe it. The figure stayed at the railing, and despite the overwhelming urge to leave, I found myself rooted to the spot, watching them as if something had taken hold of me, some force drawing me to the mystery they represented. Finally, they seemed to take a breath, an almost imperceptible movement, and leaned further over the edge, fingers loosening their grip on the rail. Instinct kicked in, and I surged forward, grabbing their shoulder to pull them back, but my hand went straight through, meeting nothing but cold, damp air. I stumbled forward, clutching at empty space as the figure dissolved into the mist. The patch of fog where they'd been moments before rippled and dispersed, leaving me standing alone at the edge of the bridge, my hands still outstretched. I stood there, staring at the empty spot where the figure had been. My hand was still outstretched, fingers slowly curling into my palm, as if they could grasp some part of the mystery that had vanished into the fog. The thick air settled again, reclaiming the bridge and folding around me in a heavy, suffocating quiet. I felt a tingling, an echo of the faceless gaze that had held me only moments before, still lingering in the chill of the fog. I forced myself to breathe deeply, to shake the bizarre encounter from my mind. Rationality tried to wedge its way back in. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe the long hours and endless quiet of night shifts had gotten to me, clouding my senses and making me see things that weren't there. After all, no one could really vanish like that. People didn't just dissolve into mist, right? Still, the encounter refused to fade, remaining as sharp as if it had just happened. I felt an overwhelming urge to move, to walk the rest of my route and shake off the feeling that I'd brushed up against something far beyond understanding. But as I resumed my patrol, every step felt strangely weighty, like walking through thick water. The quiet pressed in, dense and absolute, and the shadows seemed to stretch, somehow more alive, almost watching. Then I noticed something odd. As I walked, a faint, rhythmic sound started trailing behind me. A soft scuff, almost like a second pair of footsteps. I stopped, and the sound stopped too. I took a few steps forward, and the echo resumed, perfectly timed to match each of my own steps. I glanced around, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck prickling with awareness, but there was no one in sight, just the empty bridge, swallowed by fog. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding fragile in the oppressive silence. No response, just my words bouncing back at me, swallowed by the haze. I quickened my pace, the faint echo keeping in perfect step with me, as if whatever was making the sound was only a breath away, always there but just out of sight. Ahead, the faint outline of the bridge's support tower loomed into view, and I found myself instinctively heading towards it, drawn to the solidity, the sense of structure it offered amidst the formless mist. The closer I got, the stronger the pull, a magnetic tug that I couldn't resist. It was as if the bridge itself was guiding me, as though something within those metal beams held answers to what I'd just seen. Reaching the base of the tower, I stopped, leaning against the cold metal. The echoing footsteps fell silent, but the air around me felt thick, charged, buzzing with a strange tension. I was alone, or so I told myself, but it didn't feel that way. Something about the fog, the silence, seemed to bristle with a presence I couldn't see, and I found myself unwilling to move, as if disturbing the air might break whatever delicate balance kept me safe. Then, just as I was starting to collect myself, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper floated from somewhere above. It was faint, just barely audible, and I strained to hear it, catching only fragments of sound. At first, I thought it might be the wind brushing through the cables, or maybe some trick of the bridge's natural creaks and groans. But no, the more I listened, the clearer it became. It was a voice, low and murmuring, weaving through the air in an unfamiliar language, or maybe just words too fragmented to understand. I felt myself lean in, mesmerized by the whispering. It rose and fell like a song, an eerie rhythm that seemed to wrap around me, inviting me to listen, to understand. My pulse thrummed in my ears as I searched the shadows, but the mist was too thick, hiding everything beyond arm's reach. And still, the voice continued, filling the empty spaces around me, speaking to some part of me that I didn't even know existed. Then, as if sensing my curiosity, the voice changed, deepened, took on a pleading tone. It almost sounded like sorrow, Something in its cadence conveyed a sadness, a desperate need, as if it were begging me to listen, to see it, to understand. A knot twisted in my stomach, a dull ache of recognition that I couldn't explain. I felt drawn, compelled to reach out, to give in to whatever this voice was asking of me. I stretched my hand towards the fog, fingers brushing the damp air, when a sudden chill gripped me. A strange, intrusive thought cut through the trance. What if there's no end to this voice? What if listening means never leaving? The realization hit me, snapping me back to my senses. I pulled my hand back, feeling the weight of my own restraint. Something wasn't right here. The voice was still there, still whispering, but now it seemed to probe at me, questioning, as if it sensed my resistance. And the sorrow, that same heavy sadness, turned to frustration, an almost tangible pressure that seemed to close in around me, pressing against my thoughts. I shook my head, stepping back from the mist as though it were a living thing. With each step, the voice faded, becoming softer, more distant, until it was little more than a faint murmur blending into the hum of the bridge. But the sorrow, that strange, aching sadness, clung to the air like a mist of its own, a feeling that didn't dissipate, even as the voice died away. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the fog thinned enough for the lights of the bridge to come into sharper focus, small points of orange glinting through the grey. I let out a long breath, grounding myself in the faint familiarity of the lights. The footsteps, the voice, they were gone, but the emptiness they left felt even heavier. I started walking again, this time keeping my pace steady, my thoughts fractured and scattered by everything I'd experienced. The bridge felt different now, like it held secrets far beyond what I could see or understand, and that feeling of being watched, that presence that had lingered around me, seemed to stretch out across the entire span of the bridge, as though the very structure was alive and listening. As I neared the end of my route, my mind drifted to the figure I'd seen, to that faceless void that had stared into me with an intensity I couldn't shake. The air seemed charged with something more than fog and night, something that pulsed with memory and longing, like the remnants of lives left hanging in the mist. I realized then that my quiet hours on the bridge, the solitude I had once loved, were no longer my own. Whatever that presence was, it had found me, and now it waited, lingering in the fog, drifting through the cables and towers, stretching out to brush against the edges of my thoughts. I finished my route, steps slowing as I neared the far end of the bridge, the dim glow of the lights along the walkway, the deep hum of cables, even the soft splash of water below. They should have been familiar, grounding. But after that encounter, everything felt new, imbued with a depth I couldn't fully grasp. The fog that had once felt comforting, like a quiet buffer against the world, now seemed to hold things within it, old and restless things. It was as if the bridge itself had woken up, aware of my presence in a way it hadn't been before. By the time I got back to the guard station, the fog had cleared a little, lifting just enough for the faint outlines of the bay to reappear below. I flicked on the station's small lamp, its warm glow spilling over the empty desk and my few belongings. Sitting down, I tried to shake off the unease that clung to me, focusing on the familiar items around me, my thermos, a worn notebook, the dull flicker of the security monitors. But even these familiar objects felt strange under the weight of what I'd seen. I scanned through the security feeds, mostly out of habit, the small screens displaying various angles of the bridge. Each one showed a familiar scene, empty except for the occasional wisp of fog drifting through the edges. But then, something caught my eye, a flicker on one of the screens. I leaned in, squinting at the grainy black and white image. There, in the center of the screen, stood a figure, indistinct but unmistakably human. It was positioned near one of the support towers, facing the water with that same unnaturally still posture. The figure's outline was blurred, as if the fog itself was somehow part of them, shifting and blending with their form. My pulse quickened as I realized it was in the exact spot where I'd seen the faceless figure earlier. I reached for the radio, fingers hovering as I debated calling it in. But what would I say? That I'd seen a figure made of fog, a faceless presence that appeared and disappeared at will? The words felt ridiculous even as I thought them. No one would believe it. They'd chalk it up to exhaustion, tell me to take a break, maybe even pull me from the night shift altogether. And yet, as I sat there, staring at the screen, I knew what I'd seen wasn't just a trick of the fog. Suddenly, The figure on the screen shifted, turning slightly, as if aware it was being watched. A chill settled over me, and I felt a strange pressure building in my chest, as though the air itself had thickened around me. For a long moment, the figure remained there, unmoving, before it slowly began to dissolve into the mist, its form dissipating until the screen showed only the empty bridge once more. I leaned back in my chair, trying to process what I'd just seen. Rationality warred with something deeper, something instinctive and unsettling. A part of me wanted to grab my things, leave and not look back. But another part, the same part that had drawn me to this job, to these quiet, endless nights on the bridge, refused to turn away. The rest of the shift passed in a strange, tense silence. I stayed at the desk, watching the monitors as the fog drifted and shifted across the bridge, forming patterns that almost seemed deliberate. Shadows flickered at the edges of the screens, shapes that could have been people or could have been tricks of the light, too fleeting to capture, too intangible to name. When dawn finally broke, I felt an odd mixture of relief and unease. The pale morning light crept over the bridge, washing the fog in soft, silvery tones, until it was little more than a whisper against the metal beams. The city began to wake up, the first few cars crossing the bridge, their headlights piercing the remnants of mist. I gathered my things, feeling a strange reluctance to leave, as though part of me was still tethered to that strange, faceless presence that had found me in the fog. I made my way off the bridge, casting a final glance back at the span of steel and cable stretching over the bay. In the daylight, it looked almost ordinary, stripped of the mystery and weight that had haunted it during the night. But I knew, as I looked out over the quiet, steady flow of traffic, that something had changed. Whatever had found me in the mist wasn't just a figment of my imagination, wasn't some fleeting hallucination brought on by exhaustion or isolation. It was real as the bridge itself. Over the following nights, I returned to my shifts with a mixture of anticipation and dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that the bridge was different now, that I was being watched, not just by the occasional lost tourist or wandering soul, but by something deeper, older, woven into the structure itself. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow more substantial, as if the bridge was reaching out, drawing me further into its secrets. And then a few nights later, it happened again. The fog had rolled in thick and heavy, so dense that it obscured everything beyond a few feet. I was making my usual rounds, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the mist in narrow, dim arcs. The bridge was quiet, save for the faint hum of distant traffic and the low, rhythmic groan of the cables swaying in the wind. I was nearing the same spot where I'd seen the figure when I felt it, that familiar, oppressive weight pressing down on me, filling the air with a presence that was both tangible and unseen. This time I didn't call out. I didn't need to. I knew in some unexplainable way that whatever I was about to see would reveal itself on its own terms. I waited, letting the silence settle around me, feeling the weight of the fog pressing close, and then, out of the mist, it appeared. The figure stood just a few feet away, even closer than before. Its form was clearer now, though it still held that strange, shifting quality, as if it were part of the fog itself. I couldn't make out a face. There was only that same blank expanse, a void that seemed to pull everything in around it, bending the light, the air, even sound itself. I felt a strange, inexplicable urge to reach out, to touch the void, to understand it. But as I raised my hand, something changed. The figure seemed to react, shifting slightly, and I felt a surge of raw emotion flood the space between us. Anger, sorrow, desperation. It hit me like a wave, overwhelming in its intensity, filling my thoughts with memories that weren't mine. Images of the bridge through decades, ghostly echoes of lives lost and lives forgotten. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, dissolving back into the fog, leaving me alone once more on the empty, silent bridge. As dawn crept over the horizon, I couldn't shake the feeling that the night had changed something in me. That figure, whatever it was, I knew it wasn't just a trick of the fog or my tired eyes. The bridge held secrets that even the dawn couldn't dispel, shadows that lingered in the light. And now, with every shift of the fog, every whisper of wind along the cables, I felt the presence, as if it had entrusted me with a story that could never fully be told. I received a friend request from an odd lady who called herself the patron saint of murder, a cute, petite brunette with shadowy green eyes and pearl-white skin. Her profile stood outside the bounds of my carefully constructed list of acceptable attributes. I'm usually very careful about who I accept as an online friend, discerning what I can from available photos. My friend list number's no more than 300, a ceiling I strictly adhere to. 300 is a good round number, a reasonable circle of influence, an audience easy to follow and respond to. I have made mistakes, accepting those obsessed with politics or religion, or recording every single monotonous, dull moment of their lives, from what they eat to when they shit. Those are grounds for a quick and decisive unfriending. Her real name was Cassidy. Well, at least that's how she finally introduced herself. Who knows? Maybe her name was Karen or Dawn. I was just relieved when she finally stopped insisting on me referring to her by that ridiculous epithet. Her posts were disgusting and off-putting. It was a constant recital of murderous statistics and tidbits of information regarding some of the worst serial killers in history. More than once had I pondered pushing the delete button, but I admit I was attracted to her. In private she was more subdued, actually a bit charming. She messaged me at first, and in time we were talking regularly on the phone. Unlike her public posts, we never talked of murderers, killers, or historically insane dictators. We talked mostly about me. She was intensely interested in everything I had to say, delving deeper into each sentence I professed about my life or my desires. She never seemed bored, always expressed a desire to talk about nothing but me. Often, I would try to turn the discussion to her and inquire about who she was and where she came from, what did she like, and what did she like to do for fun. She never acquiesced and always turned the conversation back to me. She had sufficiently buttered me up. And then one day she made a proposal. "Why don't you come out to Texas? I'd love to hang out with you." My stomach churned. I didn't have the courage to meet her in person, to walk up to her, strutting my massive stature of 5 foot. 4 inches of pitiful disappointment. An online relationship is all I desired, where I could feign a more than average height, and yet I found myself agreeing to fly out to Austin, Texas to hang out with her. Flight M317 to Austin was boarding, one last chance to back out. Quit being a coward, I told myself. If she doesn't like you, then c'est la vie. Is that the saying? It's fucking life. Just live it. Determined, I boarded the plane and took my seat, convinced that I would enjoy myself, if only to travel and see a state I had never seen. My diminutive size can sometimes be a blessing, especially when forced to sit in the middle seat, the only seat available when buying a ticket at the last minute, the expense unreasonably beyond what it's worth, crammed between 2 filthy strangers. I could sit comfortably enough, but I hate when their arms touch my arms. I squeezed past the bodybuilder sitting in the aisle seat and plopped down next to the obnoxious lady sitting in the window seat. "I swear, Julie, if Bob doesn't change that presentation, I'm going to lose it. He is going to get a mouthful from me." Unfortunately, I had to hear her mouthful all throughout boarding. I prayed that the remainder of the passengers would hustle up, toss their bags in the overhead bin, and sit the hell down so we could get through the safety spiel and get in the air, whence all phone calls would have to cease, and I would no longer have to listen to this lady yap and yammer about Bob, whom I was beginning to sympathize with. Poor fucking Bob. But of course, boarding is long and tedious. The final passenger made a stink about not getting the seat she wanted. She was a robust woman in her 50s with long blonde hair streaming down to the small of her back. She wore skin-tight black spandex and a concert t-shirt with long dangling earrings. "I was supposed to be in D15, she shouted. The number shocked me. I had dodged a bullet, or I had hoped so, for if she were to convince the flight attendant otherwise, the middle-aged teenage wannabe would be sitting right next to me. "Ma'am, you're going to have to take your seat or exit the plane," explained the flight attendant. The blonde pushed aside the flight attendant and bent her head down close to the bodybuilder's face. "You're in my seat," she said with a scowl. Then she turned and looked at me with a big, wide smile and waved. "Hi, babe." She then walked away and peacefully took her assigned seat. The voice sounded familiar. No, it couldn't be. But then again, it sounded just like her. It sounded like Cassidy. I reasoned otherwise. She wouldn't be on the plane. She's in Texas, waiting in the airport. Why would she drive or fly to Nashville only to take a flight right back to Texas? I pushed the thought out of my head. It was simply coincidence. There are billions of people, and there's bound to be several that sound alike. The plane accelerated and lifted off the ground, pushing my nervous stomach against the back of my seat. The Bob-hating businesswoman next to me immediately fell asleep, like a baby in a car, her head smashed against the window, mouth wide open. She snored, grunted, and grumbled. Lord knows she was dreaming about giving Bob all the hell he deserved. The pilot announced that we were cruising at 34,000 feet and that he was turning off the seatbelt sign. We were free to roam about the cabin. "I got to piss," the bodybuilder mumbled to himself. He got up out of his seat like an overturned turtle, swinging his bulky biceps, twisting and turning to free his large body. He elbowed me twice, once in the shoulder and another in the temple. "Sorry, man. Damn plane ain't made for people like me." Finally free, the bodybuilder dashed up the aisle, unintentionally hitting everyone he passed, trying his best not to piss his pants. The blonde poked her head up and looked back. A smile flashed across her face. She looked with delight at the empty seat next to me. She sashayed down the aisle, singing loud a song only she could hear. She squeezed into the empty seat next to me. "I love this song." She pulled out her earbud and clumsily shoved it in my ear. Thrashing metal rang through my head. Chaotic distortion pounded through my ear canal. She yanked the earbud out of my ear. "That's the shit right there. I'm psyched, Dave. Oh man, we're going to have fun." I turned and looked at her in shock. "It's me, Cassidy." She leaned over and whispered, "The patron saint of murder." She bellowed out a sonorous laugh, more like a lumberjack than a dainty little woman. "But," I tried to interject, "I thought you were going to catfish me, but you look exactly like your profile. A little shorter than I imagined, but cute. You're a cutie, Dave. I'm so glad you didn't fucking lie." I looked at her in disbelief. The hypocrisy of her statement astounded me. "Ah, I see, but did I catfish you? Well, Dave, yes and no. You see, I can't take pictures of myself, a condition I have. No matter how hard I try, there's not a camera in the world that can capture my image. So I just grab a picture of someone I would like to be. It's not a falsehood, but more of a handicap." "Ma'am, you're in my seat," interrupted the bodybuilder. "You can have my seat. I'm talking to my man. We couldn't get seats together. You understand?" She turned, ignoring the bodybuilder as he put his hands in the air in disbelief. "Well, ma'am, I would have gladly switched seats if you would have asked. But now I'm not feeling so nice. Get out of my seat or I'll pull you out." He grabbed her by the arm and pulled her up out of the seat. Cassidy grabbed his lower jaw and the back of his head and violently twisted. There was a loud, sharp crack. The bodybuilder's head went limp, his chin lying flat against his back, the back of his head situated above his chest. The body slumped and fell on top of Cassidy. She slung it off and on top of the passengers sitting in the adjacent row. Screeching, hollering, and screaming ensued. A domino of fear fell across the interior of the plane. "Terrorists!" a man yelled. "Get her!" She killed a man. Who? Who killed who? There was confusion and pandemonium, a pointing of fingers, and an unsuccessful attempt to identify the assailant. Cassidy happily revealed herself. The flight attendant approached the melee, trying to calm the situation and figure out what was happening. She had no idea that there was a dead bodybuilder laying heavily across 3 poor, weak passengers. "What's happening? Please remain calm and get back to your seats." Cassidy seized her by the hair and pulled her head down. She then bit into her neck, shaking her head from side to side. She ripped out a chunk of meat and flesh, spit it out, and went in for another bite. Bite after bite, she tore into the flight attendant's neck, nearly severing her head from her shoulders. The nearby seats were awash with blood. All the while, the nearest passengers were pleading for someone to do something, but fear had paralyzed us all, for Cassidy's appearance had changed. Her eyes were a sickly yellow, and her blonde hair had fallen off, revealing a bald, pale blue skull and pointed ears. Her teeth were sharp and her fingernails long and jagged. Cassidy looked up and felt the top of head. Her chin and chest were covered in blood, meat and flesh, like a lion deep in an antelope's belly. There was also embarrassment on her face as she searched for her wig. It was obvious that her true hue of skin was blue, the painted face and false color betrayed by the top of her head. "Dang, this thing never stays put." She picked up the wig and tossed it aside in disgust. Seeing that I was terrified, she tried her best to assuage my fear. "Ah, honey, don't worry, I'm not going to hurt you." She stepped over the flight attendant and grabbed me by the arm. She led me to the bathroom and shoved me inside. "Now you just stay in here. Mama's going to have a little fun, and then you and me can have some quality time together." She slammed the door shut and made one last request. "Don't come out. I'll come get you. When I get going, I can't control myself. I love you. Do you love me?" I didn't answer, my throat dry and constricted, my mind muddled with fear and exasperation. Don't worry, in time you will love me. Bitch, get on the ground, a man commanded. I heard shuffling of feet and a band of men barking out various demands. A posse had been assembled. The good guys had finally recognized the evil to be confronted and defeated. There was movement as the men came in closer. Cassidy shrieked and growled. Hell was unleashed. For the next hour I heard suffering and dying, interrupted periodically by gleeful laughter. There was screaming, crying, pleading, scuffling, but never from Cassidy. Cassidy's strength never waned. I hoped and prayed to hear someone announce that the monster was dead. All was safe. Buckle up and get ready to land. It grew quieter as more and more souls were obliterated and dispatched into darkness. Finally, total and complete silence. The door slammed open. Cassidy's eyes, glowing yellow, fiercely contrasted against the dark blood caked all over her face. In fact, her whole body was covered in blood. There was a wide, wicked smile across her face, a mouthful of sharp, uniform teeth. She was breathing hard, her chest heaving in and out. She looked as if she wanted to eat me alive. We're calling the police. They'll be waiting for you. Hope they shoot the shit out of you. The lone survivors. The pilots were locked safe and sound in their cockpit, or so they thought. That's not nice, Cassidy responded. She pulled me out of the bathroom, dragged me to first class and shoved me into a seat. She walked up to the cockpit door and kicked it in with ease. The pilots tried to fight, but to no avail. The plane tilted. The pilots fell to the floor. She dragged them out of the cockpit. Their throats were slashed, their eyes gouged, their wounds gushing and widening, their lives quickly fading away. Without thinking, I turned and ran away from Cassidy, fear overriding my reason, as if I had any way to escape. The sight of the interior of the plane and the aftermath of Cassidy's massacre was dreadful. There were bodies torn in half, heads severed and tossed about, entrails scattered throughout. There was not one body intact, not even the first kill, the bodybuilder. Cassidy had ripped both of his arms off, the Bob-hating woman torn to pieces. I vomited and broke down in tears. I felt a hand on my shoulder. Cassidy walked around, her face no longer covered in blood, but her complexion reflecting her true nature. She was wiping away the blood from her face, but also the makeup. Her pale blue face displayed consternation. Don't worry, this will all burn up in the crash, and besides, a crash from this height tears a body apart. It will look natural. Everybody will think you're dead as well. This ain't my first rodeo. You've done this before? I managed to stammer out. Lord have mercy, he does talk. Yes, Dave, I have done this before. It's the perfect undetectable crime and it's fun. But we're going to die as well. We're going to crash. We're going to be in this plane. How in the hell do you expect us to survive? I started breathing heavy, panicking, my legs weakening. I felt as if I was about to pass out. That's up to you. You can be with me or die. You can become one of us. A vampire. She smiled, her teeth dull and normal now. Yes, a vampire, but not like in the movies. You'll still be able to walk about in the daylight. You'll be beholden to me, but that's not bad. I'm the head bitch, Dave. You stick with me and you'll have it made. I told you I loved you and I meant it. I don't care if the feeling is reciprocated as long as I get what I want. She turned and walked towards the cockpit. It's decision time, Dave. Let me push this bird to 13,000 feet. The plane suddenly fell forward and descended quickly. Cassidy made her way to the exterior door and kicked it out. The air exploded in. A roaring sound bellowed through the interior. I was unbalanced and fell to the floor. Cassidy hauled me up by the shirt and pulled me to the door. Give me a thumbs up if you want to live. I immediately shot up my thumb. Not now, silly. When we're outside. She shoved me out into the sky. I tumbled head over feet several times until finally I leveled out, remembering my training in the army. Make an even surface so you don't tumble through the air. Arms out wide, legs closed together tightly. Cassidy was falling parallel to me about 20 feet away, calm and collected, as if she had done this 100 times before. She turned her head and looked to me. She was waiting on an answer, her eyes wide with anticipation. The ground was approaching fast, my heart uncontrolled and beating sporadically. A sharp pain in my chest, the onset of a heart attack provoked by the fear of impending death. I gave her a thumbs up. Cassidy turned, put her arms down by her side and shot out towards me. She collided into me and wrapped her arms and legs around my body. I felt her sharp teeth sink into my neck. There was a cold, sickening sensation throughout my body. I heard the flap of exploding fabric. Expecting to see a parachute, I was surprised when instead I saw a leathery pair of pale blue wings extending from Cassidy's back. I remember thinking that this was the worst date ever. My heart quickened, then slowed down to nothing. I gasped for air. I either died or passed out. Whatever the case may be, I awoke and found myself in a comfortable room with a cozy fire and an elaborate bed. I am a slave. I'm allowed to go as I please. It's no use in escaping. I am what I am, dead to the world, dead to myself, and alive only for her, the patron saint of murder. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time.